Uncertainty this morning in the Middle East as the president says both Israel and Iran have already violated the ceasefire this morning, bombing each other. Israeli leaders say the country's military intercepted 2 missiles launched from Iran towards Israel earlier this morning.
Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said that Israel will, quote, respond with force after Iran's utter violation of the ceasefire declared by U.S. President Donald Trump. Katz adding that it will continue the intensive operation to strike Tehran.
Joining us this morning to talk about how the now broken ceasefire and the continued uncertainty that follows in the Middle East, we've got Navin Bapat, political science professor from the University of North Carolina. Navin, it is a pleasure as always to have you on. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
Yeah, we were just talking before we came on air about every 5 minutes, things are changing in the Middle East. This, what President Trump was calling, he thought was going to be a 12-day war. We thought there was a ceasefire on the table, and I guess there was, maybe for a matter of minutes, but now it's changing. What are your thoughts on this ever-evolving ceasefire deal that's going on?
So there was a deal on the table. There was a deal that President Trump said was accepted. Just a short while after Israel declared that Iran had violated the agreement. And so, again, as you said, it's a fluid situation. This is not as abnormal. When we look at several conflicts, sometimes it takes a while to get to ceasefires. It helps to have an international mediator, but in this case, President Trump is not a completely international mediator since the U.S. intervened on behalf of Israel to destroy some of Iran's sites. So I think we just have to kind of wait and see to sort of examine how this plays out. But I will say, I think President Trump does want some form of ceasefire, it appears. He's made that clear. I would also add probably Iran wants some form of ceasefire given the military pressure that they're under. So I think, at least I hope, eventually we do get to one, but we do have to sort of watch and see.
Well, Professor Bapat, when you talk about that international mediator, if the U.S. is in it, since we are involved in this, what country is the best mediator to kind of step in here?
I don't think there really is one at this moment. I mean, perhaps we could look at the EU as being one potential mediator, but I don't think that that would be universally accepted by any of the sides as being a sort of a fair mediator. So it's possible, but I don't think that would necessarily work. China is not really getting involved in this. They've condemned the strikes, but they don't really have the capacity to do anything about them. And Russia is preoccupied with Ukraine at the moment. So there's really no mediator. What might be able to happen is one of the states from the region could act as a mediator. That's a possibility. But many of those states have had rivalries with Iran for some time. So again, it's hard to find one that will be truly impartial.
As we look at what's happening with Iran right now, is there any worry that as Iran maybe continues to get destabilized there, that another group pops up? We know there have been numerous proxy wars fought in the Middle East. Is there a worry that a group like Hezbollah or somebody else comes into power and starts directing attacks? How, I guess, uncertain is the power grab right now?
So it is uncertain. Right now, it does look like the government is under, it still maintains control over the territory, though again, it remains to be seen how much pressure they can withstand because they're under incredible pressure. They've been facing sanctions for numerous years. They've now, in the region, lost several of their proxies. As you mentioned, Hezbollah was what suffered quite a bit in the pager attacks that happened from Israel. So they really have weakened as an organization, especially after they lost their leader, Hassan Nasrallah. Hamas has been degraded as a result of the war at the very least. I can't say what their exact capabilities are, but probably as a result of the Gaza war, they've been degraded. And I think the key thing also is that Iran has lost its key ally in Syria, in Bashar Assad. So in a lot of ways, the walls are closing in. So they don't face a good military situation. Internally within Iran, it's not clear how much instability there is. Right now, it does. There's been protests, but right now it does seem to be that the government is in control. Though again, as you mentioned, this is a fluid situation.
Professor Bapat, this is your specialty, these relationships, the regional rivalries that have taken place for not only decades, centuries there in the Middle East. Can diplomacy work? I mean, does the U.S., I know we're not the mediator, like you said, or maybe not the ideal mediator, but I know we've got options of sanctions that we can give them. Like, can this work?
Well, the U.S. has sanctioned Iran quite a bit. So in terms of how much is left to sanction, there may not be, U.S. sanctions typically target individuals. So The U.S. could start targeting more individuals within Iran, but the truth is they've hit many of them already with sanctions. So that option may have already been exhausted. The U.S. can escalate militarily, though it's something to really be clear is that would require a much larger deployment than what the U.S. did in Iraq, which I don't think there's any appetite for in the United States. And it's not even clear that such a strategy would actually produce stability within Iran. Given the experience of Iraq, it probably wouldn't. So again, in terms of good options, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot left other than negotiation. The positive, I think, from the American perspective is that right now, I think Iran also wants negotiation. I don't think at some point, they're going to run out of missiles. The rate at which they're using them may start to exceed the rate at which they can produce them. So at some point, I think they're going to need to try to make some peace to try to preserve themselves. So that is an incentive to negotiate. What actually happens, that's unclear. And also the wild card there is how Israel behaves and if Israel is going to actually cooperate with any ceasefire or not. Again, there's a lot of variables there to actually sort of keep track of, I would say.
Well, when we talk about, eventually they're going to run out of the ability to attack, how long can both countries actually withstand this, given the rate that they are attacking and returning fire on each other?
Well, I think as long as Israel has American support, they can sustain this operation for longer. So then it's a question of how long the U.S. wants to sustain it. From Iran's perspective, they do have some of their own industry where they can produce these weapons. But a lot of that industry was harmed in the initial strike, and a lot of their Air Force was harmed in the initial strike. So a lot of their assets have been harmed. And then you add to it their external assets with what they call the axis of resistance. Many of those points in their networks have been harmed in the last several months, so they don't have a lot of great options. So I think if they were to try to continue the war, they would have to really start to resort to something like terrorism, which is typically used by entities that are weaker, or they'd have to start being really sparing in their missile strikes. But one of the issues is that in terms of their missile strikes, the Iron Dome seems to have degraded some of their big missile strikes, so they're going to need more missiles, and I just don't think they have any at the moment. So again, they don't have a lot of good options left.
Navin, I'm listening to everything you're saying, and with Iran's capabilities weakened, their proxies weakened, what if Israel says, you know what, scratch that, we don't want a ceasefire, we want to continue to push and eliminate the regime in Iran? Is there a point where the United States is going to have to say, we can no longer be involved in this? Even though Israel's an ally, is there going to be a point, if Bibi pushes through, that the United States is going to have to pull back?
So the U.S. can always do that, right? That's a choice, right? So that's a choice that the Trump administration can make. It does look like in the immediate term right now, the Trump administration is trying to push the ceasefire. So it's asked Israel not to respond in a very significant way to Iran. So I think the Trump administration's preference is to try to basically wrap this up, if you can say that, even though it's been devastating, to try to end this conflict, stop it, and to move on. But Israel gets a vote in that, right? And so one thing that seems to be correct is that the United States, in terms of trying to stop Israel, hasn't really done that in the last, basically since October 7th. They've allowed Israel to do kind of what they please. So, and that may, in terms of the Trump administration, that may be difficult to stop Israel. So, again, that's difficult, right? The Trump administration could stop this, but politically it may be difficult to do so.
All right, Professor Navin Bapat with UNC Chapel Hill Professor of War and Peace, certainly an expert in this field. We've got you on speed dial, and we'll be talking more in the next couple of weeks about where this goes. Thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Queen City News Plus. Just search Queen City News on your smart TV's app store.